Hello and welcome to the LightPoint podcast. This is Dr. Don coming at you. I'm so excited because we talk about real leaders, real talk, real time, and that's exactly what's happening right now. And we have a special guest joining us today. I can't wait to engage in some thoughtful, real, transparent dialogue with Miss Samantha Stilwell, cultural anthropologist. Samantha, thank you so much for joining us.
So great to be here. I'm so excited to be a part of this.
Awesome. Now, I want to give a disclaimer, and I shared this with Samantha before we got started. I'm in a hotel room. Today is July 4th. I'm in between meetings and sessions with my client. Samantha's, calling out of Canada, right? And this is generally a regular work day for you, right?
Yeah, it's just another day in the life.
It's another day in the life. So bear with me and my T-shirt. This is my July 4th. Dr. Don's on his chill in a hotel. And I'm just so excited to have this opportunity to engage in some thoughtful dialogue with Samantha. I had the privilege of meeting Samantha maybe a month or so ago at a conference that we both were speakers in, and we just hit it off, and our thoughts and our passion around this thing that we call leadership and culture and people and life. It just is something that I think we share a lot of common threads in. So I'm really excited to just talk, man. And today is timely because it's July 4th. It is the Independence Day celebration for the United States of America. And there's a lot that we can unpack around this holiday, and we thought that's a good place to start. And any of you who are familiar with the LightPoint podcast, you know that our conversations will go where they need to go. But the reality is we're moving with authenticity, transparency and sincerity around the conversations that many of us are having or should be having. So with that being said, Samantha, thank you again for joining us. July 4th, Independence Day, 1776. Right. I did a light point maybe a couple weeks ago as we were celebrating Juneteenth. We'll get into that in a second. But essentially, the 13 colonies were no longer under British rule, and therefore we declared July 4th, 1776, our Day of Independence as what has become the United States of America. So happy Independence Day for those who celebrate it. Samantha, are you aware of this federal holiday in the United States of America?
So we're aware of it in Canada because we just know that the US always does things bigger and better than Canada does. And so for us, like July 4th, yeah, it just like it has this reputation for us as like the July 4th festivities are like huge. Like I remember my grandfather lives in San Diego, and so I grew up going there a lot. And I remember being there for a July 4th celebration, and there were like fighter jets going overhead, and there were like all of these like firework things and colors being blown into the air. Like it was just this giant thing. Like the military is heavily involved, whereas Canada Day is like it's a celebration, but it feels a lot more folky. So there's a lot more like the little towns will have their celebrations, and like maybe there'll be some fireworks in a bigger city or something like that, but there's usually just like local dancing and singing and bands playing and whatever. Like it's a lot more gimmicky, I think, whereas the US feels like intense. Like it's just like there's this huge level of pride behind it, which is kind of why I asked you earlier, right? Like what is your feeling behind July 4th? What is the climate in the US? Because in Canada, a lot of people are being very critical of Canada Day and the fact that it doesn't represent the feelings of every single citizen of Canada. So it's weird. You have like a lot of people who have immigrated to Canada and feel incredibly fortunate to be in Canada. And so they want to celebrate Canada Day because for them, it represents liberty, it represents freedom, represents a different lifestyle and different access that they didn't have before. But then you also have the Indigenous and First Nation side of the conversation, and people who are coming from marginalized communities who say that Canada Day really is an infringement on their rights. And the whole reason that Canada Day exists is because, it was on the backs of, all of these communities that suffered. So it's a really contentious topic more and more. And that's why, I'm curious to get into it I always appreciate your insights, but like, what is our cousin country and what is the United States, feeling about their Independence Day and their celebration of who they are?
I find that, of course, from 1776 on, July 4th has always been a day of acknowledgement and recognition for the sense of independence as a nation. And there, from a American patronage point of view, American heritage point of view, July 4th has always been a celebratory time. I don't know that many groups on the national stage objected what July 4th represents. And I think because there's been so much, to your point, investment in what the holiday represents and means over these centuries, that it's been so normalized. It's like Christmas. Right? Not everyone's Christian and not everyone believes in Santa. But yet somehow Christmas has been normalized. There aren't protests around Christmas.
Yeah.
So I think similarly, Independence Day has become this normalized federal holiday that everyone mobilizes around. And as I shared earlier, it's become a part of the cultural norms, but it means different things in different communities because it's been normalized. But how it applies to the cultural experience of different groups varies. For example, in the African American community, July 4th has always been a celebratory time in the context of family coming together, in the context of, barbecues and cookouts and family reunions, because the nation acknowledged it. That means things were shut down. There was no school. It's a paid day off. Blah, 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 blah. So it became this opportunity to take that holiday but celebrate it in a way that it resonated with the individuals. You're not going to a family barbecue and everyone's singing the national anthem and celebrating, separation from British rule. Like, that's not the context,
What?
right? It's an opportunity that's seized around the holiday. Whereas you have some communities who may lean on the side of patronage and really get into really just what it represents from a American heritage point of view, and they get into the flags and all those things. We normalize the fireworks and all these different things, but again, different cultural groups acknowledge the holiday in different way. Now, what I will say in the last few years, as there's been a lot of advocacy around what has now become another federal holiday, less recognized federal holiday, Juneteenth. So if you are someone who celebrates Juneteenth, then you recognize that that was the day, June 19th, 1865, where a state, in this case Texas, acknowledged that slavery was abolished, unlawful, unethical. It was the first time a state, acknowledged its illegality. Thus, it became a date where many people celebrate the end of slavery or the acknowledgement of the end of slavery, even though the abolition of slavery didn't happen June 19th.
Right away. Yeah.
And it still took many, many years, plural, before it actually was realized. And even then, we can go into a whole rabbit hole of systemic, suppression. But I say all that to say also a federal holiday, relatively new federal holiday, not acknowledged in the same way by certain communities, not acknowledged in in the same way. But it brings me to a conversation that you brought up that I think is important to talk about. And I get these questions a lot, even from my clients. So what do I do with that day? And from an equity standpoint, not equality, equity standpoint in the workplace, how do I build all these events around July 4th? Very common in the workplace in America, and it's deemed very American, so therefore it's permissible in the workplace to celebrate or create celebrations around July 4th.
Yeah.
So I'm getting a lot of more conscious HR business partners and just leaders in general in business that says, so what do I do with this other holiday then that happens before the American Independence Day? And I think it comes down to this conversation that I think observed or were a part of regarding this woman who said, I would take offense if someone not considered a part of the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, if they were not a part of that community, I would take offense to the acknowledgement of Juneteenth. Can you unpack that conversation? Because I have many thoughts around that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you do, and I hope you do. Her comment was like, I don't think it's appropriate, or like it would feel strange if somebody who wasn't from that community wished me, like if I walked up to you, I think the equivalent was like if I walked up to you and was like, oh, hey, Dante, or I sent you a message on WhatsApp and was like, hey, Dante, happy Juneteenth. Like for her, it was like, that's weird. And like, that's not the way, like we can, one another in the community can wish each other that, but like, it's not necessarily appropriate or the right way to show support for a white, a white person objectively. Cause I think, anybody else is technically falls into some kind of minority group. But it's like for a white person to walk up to somebody and to say, happy Juneteenth. Like that's not because, and I can kind of understand it in the sense that it's not something to like, you're not you're celebrating it, but it's also, there's a lot of history that comes with that. And to just go up to somebody when you don't understand the history necessarily and be like, happy Juneteenth, they're kind of like, well, why are you like, are you wishing it to me in the same way that you would a Merry Christmas type of situation just because it's a holiday? Or like, do you actually understand the gravity of the situation? So I wonder how much of that comment as well that she made was wishing me a happy Juneteenth doesn't actually show me that you're an ally. Being an ally means actually taking action, especially as coming from a position of privilege. That wasn't in that comment. I'm reading into it, obviously. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts? Like, do you have white people who wish you a happy Juneteenth? Would you find that a little bit bizarre that somebody's just sending you a message and not from your community and being like, how do you, I'm going to send the unpacking back your way.
This is a great conversation. Okay, so first, to answer part of your question, I have not had one white person in my entire life, and particularly once Juneteenth was formally acknowledged as a federal holiday, ever approach me and say happy Juneteenth. And you know what? I want to rephrase that. Maybe a couple of my team members, because they understand my views and they know who I am as a person, and so I want to backtrack that, because when they listen to this podcast, they're gonna be like, "What? I wish you." Now, with that being said, I think it is extremely valid as human beings to recognize that there is a lot of distrust and around, understanding. Let me rephrase that, because I'm being too careful with my words. I think it's valid. I'm like, this is the LightPoint podcast. What am I doing?
Exactly. We got to be raw and honest.
It's valid for a person of color to scratch their head for a white person walking up to them saying happy Juneteenth. Because one, it has not been a formally and consistently recognized holiday. Most employers don't even acknowledge it, even though it's a federal holiday. They can't tell an employee they're not that they can't take the day or observe the day because it's federally protected, but it hasn't become a focal point in most employers to know you can almost guarantee you're not getting the day off, right? I mean, there's so many, ironically, even though they're both Independence Days, even though they're both federal holidays, we take Christmas off, we will not get June 19th off. So a person arbitrarily walking up to someone and saying Happy Juneteenth would feel odd. And that's just human nature, right? Where is this coming from? Are you being sarcastic, or do you truly believe? Do you even know? Can you even give me the context of the holiday before you wish it? Because it's not normalized, even though it's a federal holiday. So it would be very abnormal for someone to acknowledge it. Now, I can also tell you that there are Americans who probably have forgotten the year of actual independence of America, right? Do you even know or do you remember that it's 1776? Do you even know that it impacted the 13 colonies? Do you know? But still, no one would scratch their head. So yes, I think it's just human nature to question someone's intent when being that day being acknowledged. With that being said, I think it is the complete opposite of what we should want to happen around the holiday. The minute we make it a Black holiday or a BIPOC holiday, which is a term that we didn't create, by the way, I use it because I'm in this formalized circle of, practitioners. But the reality is, I think it's the minute we start to marginalize the holiday, we marginalize the importance of it. So who said that only the people who were impacted the most by enslavement should be the ones to celebrate the holiday? Now, unfortunately, people of color were the ones to advocate for it. That does not mean that we should be the ones to only celebrate it. It's the acknowledgement that slavery was not only illegal, but immoral. Why wouldn't, and there were many people of color, of various colors, who fought for or advocated for the end of slavery, who fought, just like there were many people who advocated for the eradication of segregation, just like there were other people of color who celebrated the civil rights movement. But somehow these socio-political and frankly just movements that speak to certain cultural groups become marginalized in and of itself because of the nature of it, instead of looking at the bigger picture. Why wouldn't, as Americans, we say, yes, we finally woke the fuck up, excuse my language, and said, this isn't cool? Now, we know for many years, not everyone believed that. Right? Yes. We had a whole civil rights movement, a whole civil war centered around it, right? So we know that not everyone's going to believe that that was a good thing. And maybe their ancestors didn't believe that was a good thing. But in 2024, why can't we stand on Juneteenth and say we made a shift as a nation and we finally acknowledged it despite many who still had conflicting views. And now in 2024, we can stand on the fact that we would never go back there, and we can celebrate the true independence of this enslaved group of people.
Yeah.
So it opens up a can around, I wonder why we can't. And how deep rooted is it to the extent that we don't truly believe it anyway? Right? Sometimes you see what I'm saying? Like it opens up a can of deep rootedness around how important is it to our nation? Right. And so this is why I go back to, I'm going to scratch my head when certain people approach me saying Happy Juneteenth, because is it met with authenticity and sincerity around that acknowledgement of that day? Do you believe it to be true?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think a lot of, because we're having a similar conversation in Canada around Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is a day that was commemorated to recognize the colonialism and the enslavement and the abuse of Indigenous people in Canada. And this is also something, right, where it's like you can wish people. I mean, that's also where it's more complicated, because the average person, unfortunately, because of how Canada is set up and how the indigenous like reservations and kind of neighborhoods and everything are set up, it's not that often that you come across First Nations people unless you're actually making an effort to do so. Um, so I think it's less often that, for example, I would have somebody that I would cross on the street or somebody in my circle that I would, go and send a message to say Happy Truth and Reconciliation Day. But I think the discourse around that has also been similar, where it's to say, in a lot of ways, and from what I've heard from First Nations communities and from Indigenous communities, is that they considered Truth and Reconciliation Day to be a step in the right direction, to say, okay, we are recognizing objectively, like nobody can take this away from us now. It's clear that as a country, we agree that we royally shit the bed and that we caused a ton of trauma and abuse, and we are accountable for that. On the flip side, it almost feels like, because then you hear like other discourse around it, which is that it almost feels like a here, take your day and shut up.
Yeah,
Like a now you have your Truth and Reconciliation Day, so now you don't get to complain, you don't get to talk about, because look, we gave you an entire day all to just to celebrate you.
that's right.
And I think that is where it becomes complicated. And so I wonder if it's the same thing with Juneteenth, where it's kind of like, well, hey, white person, like, don't wish me a happy Truth and Reconciliation Day, or don't wish me a happy Juneteenth, because if you do that, then you feel like you have no more work to do. Like, you've done your good deed for the Black community, or you've done your good deed for the Indigenous and First Nations communities. And so now you can just go around your life for the other 364 days, that you're living in a year. And you can just go around and forget that this is a thing. I would much rather you not wish me this day, but on a day-to-day basis, feel like, how can today I give back to these communities and support them? Like, that feels more powerful than just being like wishing me for
Sure,
this holiday.
sure,
Right. So I'm
sure.
almost wondering if like that wishing somebody removes some of the importance or the obligation to do more than just wish somebody a happy whatever day.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a very fair question and observation, because I would imagine there are many who may experience that the premise of I liken it to someone causing you harm, and then they apologize, but the depth, the impact, the of the harm was so significant that the apology in and of itself is difficult to receive. And somehow there's resentment formed around the apology, because you're like, you think that fixes my broken leg, right? Or whatever. And I
Yeah.
don't, so I liken it to that experience. And there's this misconception, and I've heard this language more frequently than not. And it's especially among our young people who, through the attempt to erase history coupled with inaccurate history, they are not being taught our American history in its authentic, self. And so it feels even more far removed, this connection to the impact, the pain, the trauma of it, right? So I'm hearing a lot of language around, well, that's not me, those weren't my people, those weren't my family. Why are we still talking about it? Why do I have to? But imagine if we take ourselves out of this social or political point of view, and we just say, sometimes trauma can run so deep, and that the healing process is difficult. And if the only way to heal something is to acknowledge the truth and reality of the damage and the trauma, unpack it, clean it out, treat it, watch it, nurture it. So when you have, even when and the trauma points go beyond slavery, we're talking about systemic trauma perpetually. This is
Yeah.
not just, oftentimes we marginalize it to the conversation around slavery. We're talking about systemic trauma over and over and over and over again on the basis of the color of your skin or your ethnicity or what have you. So so yes, the trauma still rings true in a world that is trying to separate itself from its history, or I shouldn't say world, but at least our nation is trying to separate itself from its history. So yes, the resentment still rings true, even when someone may genuinely just want to wish you Juneteenth, and it just felt right to wish you Juneteenth because I want to show you some respect to the holiday. Just like people say happy fourth and don't necessarily connect it to independence, right? I mean, so I try to move through this world and through my life some measure of objectivity and empathy for everybody, but
Mm.
not naive to the reality of our social constructs, our political constructs, our manipulation and all those things that come with it, because we're
Yeah.
flawed as man or human, and and we come with shit. So I try to put. That's why I argue that Juneteenth, like July 4th, doesn't have to be marginalized to one group of people or persons. Um, but I understand that, man, this thing runs deep and it runs wide, and there's a lot of trauma and resentment that comes with it, you know. So I want to pivot this dialogue, because then how does this translate to other areas of our life or in the workplace? We're talking about a holiday,
Yeah.
but we can get as granular as, what are the implications of workplace induced trauma? What are the
Hmm.
implication of socially induced trauma? Like, there's so many different considerations that I think still the, the premise remains the same, right? Healing requires some fundamental steps. And is it the responsibility or obligation, or who owns the responsibility or obligation to foster that healing process? Or this is just a perpetual, you can have a scar, man. A scar can spread, and it starts to have impact underneath. Scar tissue starts to spread like vines. So I'm like, it's so many different places that I go to when I think about how we help organizations transform or transcend beyond the barriers that have limited their growth or their
Hmm.
pursuit of their purpose or pursuit of their mission. And then you or I come in and we start to unpack the trauma that has ensued in the form of many things.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
how do we nurture that healing and that growth process? 'Cause I don't even know if we talk about it in this context.
No. No, because I mean, so this is one thing where, and maybe I don't know, I'm gonna get canceled by my fellow HR community for saying this, but I think, HR and people ops tries to be something that it's not a lot of the time. Um, we try to stand outside of the we're just admin, or we're just there to, do employee files or legislation or employee rights and these kinds of things. We try to be a part of the employee experience. The issue is that we are not formally trained to deal with the employee experience, because the employee experience, to your point, has a ton of trauma attached to it, especially when you want to start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So for me, it is actually incredibly, or I see it personally as incredibly unethical to have these conversations, to bring in, like celebration of International Women's Day or Juneteenth or these kind of things, to have these conversations in your workplace as a way of celebration or to bring, awareness to it, without then coupling that with some kind of mental health support or therapy. Because what otherwise happens is you're an HR person, you say, you know what, I'm here to support diversity, like DEIB in the workplace. This is really important to me. I'm an ally, like all of these, fun buzzwords that we use. That's really, really great. But what you're about to do is you're about to open up a conversation that is going to open up a lot of wounds. And you don't know you think, and this is the other thing is HR, we think we know every employee's experience because we're best friends with them. And if we're doing our job effectively, we know who they are, we know their kids' names, we know, where they grew up, like all of these kinds of things. But we also have to realize that if you're a white HR practitioner, there will always be that power imbalance. And it doesn't really matter how close you get, there will always be stuff that you do not know about their experience, especially as it relates to their marginalization or their oppression, their experience with oppression. And so for me, if you're you're opening up all of these conversations, you don't know what trauma they have associated with it. And then you just expect them to kind of go off. And then you're just not doing anything. You're not stitching them back up. You're not giving them the antiseptic that they need to make sure that it doesn't get infected. You're not going and doing all of the aftercare to make sure that the scar is as reduced as possible. You're not doing any of that. So this is where and it's unfortunate, but I think that and I mean, this is again, I'm saying this from my perspective, but coming from a big position of privilege for sure. But my belief is that, and I'd love your perspective on this, the path to true equity in a workplace isn't sexy. It's not all of these big programs. It's not all of these big initiatives. It's not all of these big speaking sessions and lunch and learns and all of this stuff that's very public. It's actually incredibly personalized, which means that you are going to be, and you're not necessarily as an HR practitioner or as a manager, you're not going to be the person who actually helps this person feel safe in their workplace, but you can direct them, towards the right resources and tools who will be able to do that. You can have a therapist who works with your organization to come in and have those conversations, or you can invest in that as part of your health insurance or these types of things to say, I'm not trained to be able to help you with the trauma that you want to heal and need to heal in order to be the best version of yourself at work. And so the best way that I can be an ally is actually not to go and scream and shout that I'm an ally, and not to make it known to the world that I'm an ally, but is to direct you, towards other people who actually have the training and resources to be able to help you. So I think that's it's a big conversation, because I think that even for the most DE&I minded people coming from a position of power or position of privilege, there is going to be ego attached to everything that we do. It's impossible for us to be altruistic about that because we don't actually know what that experience is like. And we want our name attached to it because we don't like having to deal with the messiness of being, one of the, of having our ancestors be the ones who caused all of this harm, or even in our actions subliminally without realizing it, we're still causing harm, right? We don't like that. And so it's kind of a way of forgiving ourselves by saying, yeah, but look at all of these great things I did to help. And it's like, but that's not actually what's going to help. Because you creating initiatives that help you heal aren't actually helping the real victims heal. So yeah, those are some of my high level thoughts.
No, I love this. When I think about what you just shared, for me, so one, I would say in general context, I do believe that we are missing a significant nuance to this DE&I or DEIB conversation, focus, effort. I can use many, many words. The hardest part of this is trying to address the implications of an organization's actions and those actions that may have impacted someone's DE&I experience that happened outside of the organization. There is so much complexity behind someone's lived experiences. So how, as an organization, do I somehow, to your point, if I'm going to properly treat something, how do I acknowledge that all of those factors influences your experience, and I have some, and what level of responsibility do I have as an employer to somehow impact that when you are in our workplace? So it's a lot easier to then start. I don't even want to, say easy, because it's not easy, but it seems more tangible and palpable to look at internal systems, processes, resources, programs, initiatives, because I feel a bit more like I have control over that. And is it my responsibility to unpack the factors that will influence your experience to the extent that it informs what I do as an employer? And I think that that's a heavy conversation. Like, how do I, as an employer, get after this? So I just try to be socially, some try to be socially or politically conscious. They try to say, well, I think I should acknowledge these things on the surface. But I think I go back to, do you treat DE&IB as window dressing for your organization? Or does it connect with your core belief system and what you believe is necessary for you to pursue your purpose, your mission, your vision, and why you bring people together every day?
Yeah.
And where I go all the way back to that, because organizations get lost trying to respond to what they believe their consumer or buyer or investor wants to see. And they fall short because it's disingenuous and it doesn't actually connect to their capacity to execute their purpose, their vision, their mission. There's inauthentic connection between what they profess to be a core value and how they actually execute their business. So then I'm just going to do the surface level thing. So first I got to decide, is this truly at the depth of my belief system? Is this necessary for me to focus? And if it is, then now I'm committing to doing the work, which means I can't ignore the healing or the trauma, that's connected to this thing. There's a reason why we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace. That's a human experience, not a racial experience, not an ethnic experience. But guess what? There's trauma connected to it that is racially founded, that is ethnically founded, that is genderly founded. We can't ignore that if we're going to have if we believe this at the core, at the heart of our belief system, then I can't ignore the trauma. I have to somehow connect the work I'm doing to this, to that. Not in a way but rather sometimes it's bringing awareness. Sometimes it's helping people connect to their own self-awareness. Sometimes you can still choose as an organization the boundaries by which you get after this. But I think the disconnect goes all the way back to foundationally, fundamentally, does it truly matter to you? Because if it doesn't, then you're going to throw some, common bullshit initiatives at it that people are going to see right through, and it's going to be pomp and circumstance. And this is why you get the eye rolls.
Yeah.
Because people are like, you don't really believe what you're saying right now. What do you mean happy Juneteenth? What do you mean happy Cinco de Mayo? Do you even understand what that means to me or my family?
Yeah.
So to your point, they're not that the deeper work. Well, most organizations' core values are freaking window dressing. Or 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, when Grandpa's grandpa founded the company, maybe he believed it. But the active practice of these values and how it manifests behaviorally in an organization, I would venture to say that most organizations are not embodying their core values every day.
Oh, no,
So,
of course not.
so
Yeah.
it's right. So it's not informing your engagement, your interaction, your decision making, even in the context of DE&IB, even in the context of when you consider what holidays are important and what not. I don't have any ideological view on what I think every organization should celebrate or not celebrate. I could care less. What's important
Yeah.
to you in the fulfillment of of why you exist as an organization? Let's start there, because I'd rather you move with authenticity. Because guess what? Your workforce is going to decide for themselves whether you're
Mm.
going to be a fit or not.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of organizations struggle, and it's the future of work. They're going to have no choice ultimately.
That's right.
Um, is to figure out this authenticity side of things, and the unfortunate or the difficult, the time consuming, the energy consuming part of authenticity is being comfortable living in the nuance and being comfortable understanding that you can't, like, not every single Black employee is going to have the same experience, right? So it's like, if I go up to my godmother who immigrated from Ghana when she was in her late 20s, and I were to wish her a happy Juneteenth, she'd kind of be like, "Why are you like I'm from Africa. Like we didn't have them." It's like, just because I'm Black doesn't mean that my ancestors were slaves, and that I was living in America and all these kind of things. So I think there's so much nuance to any of these experiences. And I think in not I think in unfortunately in business, we replicate what our brains are doing on a regular basis, which is we're trying to find patterns,
Yes.
right? Because if we can find patterns, then we use less energy to make sense of things. And then when, we can apply one single action to a whole pattern, and we trust that there's going to be some kind of chain reaction, and we
You
can
bet.
fix a number of things at once. And like, that's a great use of resources and time. The issue is that the question of marginalization and systemic oppression in the workplace, in society as a whole, but in the workplace, there are no patterns. Everybody, based on, right, there's like that conversation in anthropology we talk a lot about, and I know in a lot of other marginalized communities, that the conversation around intersectionality, right? So you can be of a marginalized community, but you were from a very high social class, or
Yeah.
you were a man, or you were from a religion
Yeah.
that was, respected within the country that you were from, which means that suddenly you're higher up on the spectrum in terms of privilege than somebody else. That's why we have this conversation around men in general have higher privilege, but a Black man has less privilege than a white woman,
Sure.
despite the
Sure.
fact that
Sure.
she's a woman. So it is so incredibly nuanced. And so that's why, again, to go back to this idea of how do you handle diversity in the workplace, that's the wrong question to be asking. Because just the fact that you said diversity in the workplace means that there isn't a how do you handle, there's what are the many facets of handling it, right? It's like there
Right.
is no one fix all solution that you can just implement and be like, bam, here we go. So I think it's, and the unfortunate side of our approach to diversity is, and I think it's even for people who are coming from these minority groups, is the assumption that other people from your minority, from your same grouping, have experienced trauma in the same way that you have, and have the same lived experiences that you have. And I remember having a really great conversation with a woman who's of Indian descent, but she grew up in the Middle East, and then she spent time in the US. And so her experience of being Indian is incredibly different than some of the people that she knows who immigrated from India to the US, or who never left India and who have stayed there. But she's like, I often get confronted by other Indian people kind of saying, yeah, but like, you get it, right? And she's like, actually, I don't, because my trauma and my experience with oppression is very different from that. It's not to say that I didn't experience it, but it is to say that it doesn't look the same as yours. And so I think, again, as humans, we're constantly trying to find those things that we have in common. And I think that that is the antithesis to successfully handling diversity. We need to stop looking at what we have in common, and we need to start looking at what differentiates us in our experiences. And then we can engage in those conversations to say, okay, so despite all of us having different experiences, how do we start to now make sure each and every one of us feels safe and respected and celebrated in the workplace? That's nuance. It's going to look very different. It means, as a leader, you are going to have to learn how to approach each one of your employees differently. You are going to have to adapt to that. And I think our brains are incredibly capable of that growth. So yes, it's going to take a lot of upfront energetic investment, but eventually it'll become a habit and a routine, and so your brain will, start to normalize that and start to do it automatically. But yeah, the upfront investment for true diversity at work, truly respecting your, the diversity that you have in front of you, it's an incredible lift for your brain to do. And
Yes.
so I think most people try to, just do other things that feel simpler because they, on the surface, it makes them feel like they handled it. They can sleep easy and then they can wake up tomorrow and try something different. But that's not the change that the world needs to see, unfortunately.
Sure, 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 sure. No, I love that. That point of view. That's the irony in all of this. Through the effort to foster diversification, equity, inclusivity, you perpetuate the very thing that you're trying to mitigate.
Yeah.
When we talk about intersectionality, the premise around that means that there's interdependencies to the extent that there's so much ambiguity, we almost have to reevaluate and step back and say, wait a minute. There's so many nuanced differences in everyone's experiences that this approach is actually marginalized. It's doing the complete opposite of what you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
when you start throwing, for example, you want to start throwing your oversimplification of something so complex is in the form of, let me try to drive gender diversity. So I'm going to attach a quota to the number of women I want in positions by X period, or the number of people of a certain racial group or ethnic group. You are literally, in the context of that strategy, perpetuating the marginalization of other groups in order to try to solve for X. Because you're not dealing with systemically, how did I arrive here where I have disproportionate number of men or disproportionate number of white people or disproportionate number of whoever or whatever to get me here? Because that's the harder conversation. Now I have to get at our core values. Now I have to get at our decision makers who made those hiring decisions. Who I have to start to look at my systems to validate their equity and fairness in process.
Yeah.
Not to attach a quota that perpetuates, regardless of someone's skill set or competency. I got to hit my quota, so let me make sure I hire this person. So to your point. We got it all jacked up, Sam, and we have to start having the harder conversations as HR practitioners, as culture practitioners, as organizational psychologists, as anthropologists, right? We all have to be in a position to have the harder conversations. You and I talked about this before. Like, I cringe at some of these conferences and the language I hear and this perpetual, let me look for patterns and solve for the pattern and let me apply what I perceive to be the best practice. Meanwhile, I'm not actually getting at root cause.
Yeah.
And it's the same reason why we haven't seen movement globally or even nationally in employee engagement, in satisfaction in the workplace, in the perception of diversity, equity, and inclusion from an experiential point of view. The movement it's minuscule holistically because we're not getting at root cause. We're not digging out the wound. We're not acknowledging the trauma. We're not doing the harder work. So then I go back to, is it important to do the work? It has to connect to your purpose, your vision, your mission as an organization. Because if it doesn't, we're going to see right through it anyway.
Absolutely.
And to your point, and we could say this for another conversation, is the shift in the working population is requiring organizations, whether they like it or not, to get into the weeds of the issues, the traumas, the thing. Individuals are spending sometimes 50% of their day, 50% of their week in the workplace. Whether you like it or not, somehow your purpose, vision, mission has to fundamentally connect to the value and belief system or vice versa.
Yeah.
of this individual, which means you don't get to ignore. If you want people to bring that side of them to the workplace in alignment to your core values, then you don't get to ignore the implications of their lived experiences. Not trying to solve for every nuance of that, but we have to acknowledge that it exists and it should inform our decision making as business leaders.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I honestly, and I think this is the, so I see your statistic and I raise you one. Because I think a lot of business leaders will sit there and kind of say, yeah, but I can still get stuff done. I can still accomplish stuff if I'm not focusing on that. And there's research that I got into recently that shows that the human brain, when a human being is trying to figure out the context of a situation, right? So as humans, we're always trying to figure out what the context is of a situation so that we can know if it's going to be helping or hindering our ability to survive, because that is our ultimate goal. And so our brain is constantly trying to find context. And usually we can find context relatively quickly. That's why we tend to hang out in social groups that, are familiar to us and all of these kinds of things. In the workplace, if you are not creating a space where employees can show up 100% as themselves, which means giving them the resources. Perfect.
Thank you so much for sharing, Samantha. We had a bit of technical difficulty, so you may notice a little glitch in the video. I clearly am not a producer. I'm going to stick to my day job. But with that being said, we've had some really thoughtful, I believe, authentic dialogue as we talk about these are social norms, the things that we celebrate, the things that we acknowledge outside of the workplace, inside the workplace, and the implications that that these celebrations has on our lived experiences. And I think we unpack the sensitivity around that, the complexity around that, and everyone's unique journey. And I think there's a common thread in all of this. If we can move with the level of compassion, empathy, consideration for every human that we encounter in our life, I think we have a greater potential to be able to navigate a lot of what we've been talking about around these complexities and these nuances that make up our lived experience. Samantha, thank you so much for investing this hour with me as part of the LightPoint podcast. This is something that is very important and passionate to me, and it's something that we're trying to get our get grounded around and get some stability around. So thank you for taking part in this journey with us. I really appreciate you and the work that you do each and every day. So I appreciate you. Thank you. I look forward to more thought-provoking dialogue. Appreciate you. Thanks so much. Until next time, folks, thanks for tuning into the LightPoint podcast. Real leaders, real talk, real time.